What would it take for the FBI to quietly walk into your family's home, stay for 2 hours, and then leave without saying a single word? No press conference, no statement, no reassurance, just silence. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. That's the moment this story stopped being about a missing person and started becoming something far more unsettling. Because this isn't happening to a stranger in a small town no one's heard of. This is happening to the family of Savannah Guthrie, a woman millions of Americans see every morning, smiling through headlines, guiding the country through breaking news. But behind the camera, her family is living inside a nightmare that no amount of professionalism can prepare you for. An 84-year-old woman, a quiet Saturday night, a family dinner that ended like so many others. And then, nothing. No goodbye, no explanation, no trace of where she went. Savannah Guthrie's mother, Nancy, vanished from her own home, not from a busy street, not from a dangerous neighborhood, from a place that was supposed to be safe, familiar, predictable. Think about that for a second. How does someone in her mid-80s dealing with health limitations simply disappear into the night without a sound? Without a witness? Without a clear trail? That question alone is disturbing. But what truly sends chills down the spine is what happened next. Law enforcement didn't just treat this as a missing persons case. Very quickly, the tone changed. The language shifted. And then, federal agents were suddenly involved. On Tuesday afternoon, FBI agents were seen arriving at the home of Savannah's sister Annie in Arizona. They stayed for roughly 2 hours. Inside that house, multiple agencies met behind closed doors. The FBI, local sheriff's deputies, investigators who have seen hundreds, even thousands of cases like this. When they left, reporters were waiting, cameras were rolling, questions were asked, and the agents said nothing. No confirmation, no denial. No, we're doing everything we can. Just silence. If you've followed true crime long enough, you know that silence can mean one of two things. Either investigators have nothing, or they have something they don't want to talk about yet. So which is it here? To understand why this case escalated so fast, you have to go back to the last night Nancy Guthrie was seen. Saturday evening was ordinary. She had dinner. She was driven home by her daughter Annie. There were no arguments reported, no distress calls, no signs that anything was wrong. She was dropped off at her home in Tucson, and that was it. That was the last confirmed moment anyone saw her. By Sunday, concern set in. By Monday, alarm bells were ringing. And by the time law enforcement fully assessed the situation, they reached a conclusion that made this case dramatically more serious. Investigators now believe Nancy Guthrie did not leave her home willingly. Let that sink in. Police have stated they believe she was taken from her home against her will, possibly in the middle of the night. Not confused, not wondering. Taken. And that belief didn't come from a hunch alone. In newly surfaced footage shared by News Nation, something deeply unsettling appears outside Nancy's home. A dark trail. A pattern on the tiles leading up to the door. Something that, according to investigators, immediately raised red flags. Officials haven't publicly confirmed exactly what it is. They don't have to. Anyone who's ever watched an investigation unfold knows why that detail matters. And then there's the statement from Pima County Sheriff Chris Nanos, a man with 5 decades in law enforcement, 50 years of crime scenes, 50 years of disappearances, 50 years of worst-case scenarios. He said he had a gut feeling, not a theory, not a guess, a gut feeling that this wasn't just a missing person. According to him, something about that scene told him there was more going on. Something that didn't fit. Something that didn't align with the idea of an elderly woman simply walking away into the night. He pointed out something else that's hard to ignore. Nancy Guthrie, by all accounts, couldn't physically go far on her own. She wasn't capable of traveling long distances. She couldn't have made it far without help. So ask yourself this. If she didn't leave willingly, if she couldn't leave on her own, and if investigators believe she was taken, then who knew she was there? And more importantly, why has the FBI been brought into this so early? The most dangerous mysteries don't begin with screams. They begin with silence, no alarms, no shattered glass, no frantic phone calls in the middle of the night, just a quiet house, a locked door, and an elderly woman who should still be inside, but isn't. To understand why investigators so quickly stopped treating this as a routine missing person case, you have to reconstruct the final hours before everything unraveled. Because when you slow this story down, detail by detail, something starts to feel deeply wrong. Saturday night wasn't dramatic. It wasn't tense. It wasn't memorable in the way tragedies usually announce themselves. It was normal. Nancy Guthrie spent the evening out to dinner, family time, conversation. The kind of ordinary moment no one thinks twice about, because it has happened 100 times before. Afterward, her daughter Annie drove her home to her house in Tucson. There were no reports of arguments, no concerns raised, no signs of distress. Annie dropped her mother off, watched her go inside, and left. That's it. No final text. No late-night call. No indication that this was the last time she would be seen. Now pause here for a second, because in cases involving elderly disappearances, investigators always ask the same early questions. Was the person confused? Did they suffer from dementia? Could they have wandered off? Was there a history of leaving the house late at night? And according to everything law enforcement has suggested so far, none of those boxes were checked. Nancy was 84 years old. She suffered from physical ailments that made independent movement difficult. As Sheriff Chris Nanos would later point out, she couldn't simply walk long distances. She couldn't go far on her own. This wasn't someone who could vanish quietly and survive outside for long, which immediately creates the first contradiction. If she didn't intend to leave, and she couldn't physically go far, then how does she disappear from a locked home overnight? By Sunday, concern started to grow. Calls went unanswered. The house was quiet. No movement, no explanation. And when authorities began assessing the scene, something didn't sit right. There were no clear signs of forced entry. No broken doors. No obvious struggle inside the home. In some cases, that points investigators toward voluntary disappearance. But not here, because the absence of chaos can sometimes be just as telling as its presence. Law enforcement sources have indicated that Nancy likely didn't leave on her own. Investigators believe she was taken from her home against her will, possibly in the middle of the night. That conclusion didn't come lightly. It came from inconsistencies, details that didn't add up when placed next to who Nancy was and what she was physically capable of. And then there's the detail investigators haven't fully explained, but also haven't denied. Outside the home, near the doorway, something was reportedly observed that shifted the tone of the entire investigation. Footage shared by News Nation showed what appeared to be a dark trail on the tiles leading up to the door. Authorities have been careful with their language, but they haven't dismissed it either. Ask yourself this: why would experienced investigators immediately escalate a case if nothing unusual was found? Why would they move so quickly toward the theory of abduction? Why would the sheriff, with 50 years of experience, say his gut told him there was more than just a missing person? And perhaps the most unsettling question of all, if someone took Nancy Guthrie from her home, they didn't act randomly. They knew where she was. They knew she was vulnerable. They knew the timing, which brings the focus back to the people closest to her, not in accusation, but in proximity. Annie was the last person to see Nancy alive. That doesn't mean wrongdoing. But in every investigation, last contact matters. It establishes the timeline. It defines the window. It narrows the possibilities. And as that window narrowed, something else happened that raised the stakes dramatically. Federal agents became involved. Not days later, not weeks later. Almost immediately. The FBI doesn't step into cases like this unless there is a reason. Jurisdictional complexity. Evidence suggesting interstate involvement, or signs that the crime itself is more serious than it first appeared. Which leads to a chilling realization. Whatever investigators believe happened that night, whatever they saw at the scene, whatever concerns were raised behind closed doors, it was serious enough to bring in the highest level of law enforcement, and serious enough that they are not ready to talk about it yet. And when investigators stop talking, it's usually because they've started listening very closely to something else. Because the next phase of this case doesn't center on what Nancy did. It centers on who might have been watching. This is the moment the case surrounding Nancy Guthrie crossed an invisible line, from troubling to terrifying. And it happened without a single word spoken to the public. On Tuesday afternoon, federal agents arrived at Annie Guthrie's home in Arizona. Not one or two officials stopping by for a courtesy check. Multiple agents, multiple vehicles. Local sheriff's deputies alongside them. Cameras captured them entering the property. They stayed for roughly 2 hours. 2 full hours. No visible urgency, no chaos. Just controlled movement and closed doors. And when they left, nothing. No comment, no reassurance, no explanation. If you've ever followed an active investigation, you know how rare that silence is. Authorities are usually eager to calm the public, to reduce speculation, to say something, anything, to maintain control of the narrative. But here, they chose restraint. That choice alone tells you something critical, because investigators don't go quiet when they're confused. They go quiet when they're building a case. To understand why federal involvement became necessary, you have to look at what investigators were reportedly focused on back at Nancy's home. According to law enforcement sources and footage circulated by News Nation, there was something outside the residence that immediately caught attention. A dark trail visible on the tiles near the doorway. It wasn't brushed off. It wasn't dismissed as nothing. Instead, it became part of the reason officials shifted their language from missing to taken. Sheriff Chris Nanos didn't mince words when he spoke publicly. Based on his experience, 5 decades in law enforcement, he said his gut told him this was not a simple disappearance. He emphasized Nancy's physical limitations, pointing out that she could not have gone far on her own. That detail matters more than it seems, because when investigators assess a scene, they're not just looking at what's there, they're looking at what shouldn't be. An 84-year-old woman vanishing without leaving behind medication, without taking personal items, without signs of preparation. That's not wandering. That's interruption. And interruption suggests outside involvement. Which brings us back to the FBI's visit to Annie's home. These meetings aren't casual. They're deliberate. Investigators ask precise questions. They revisit timelines down to the minute. They probe relationships, routines, and recent changes. Not because they assume guilt, but because patterns often hide in plain sight. And here's where the story takes another uncomfortable turn. Authorities have not said what was discussed in that 2-hour meeting, but they also haven't denied that Savannah Guthrie herself was present. That matters because it signals the investigation has moved into a deeply personal phase. Family cooperation becomes central. Every detail, every phone call, every visit, every interaction is suddenly relevant. Ask yourself this: if the FBI believes Nancy was abducted, what are they trying to determine next? Who had access to her schedule? Who knew she would be alone? Who understood her limitations? Abductions, especially involving elderly victims, are rarely random. They're crimes of opportunity or intention. And intention requires knowledge. That's why the lack of forced entry is so troubling. It suggests Nancy may have opened the door, or believed she was safe doing so, which raises a chilling possibility. What if she recognized whoever was there? What if she trusted them? This is where the story becomes hardest to sit with, because the closer investigators look, the more the focus shifts from the house itself to the human connections around it. Not accusations, not conclusions, just questions, unanswered, heavy questions. And as the FBI continues working quietly behind the scenes, one thing is clear: they are not looking for someone who wandered away. They are looking for answers about something that happened to her, something deliberate, something controlled, something that required planning. And whatever investigators uncovered, whatever made them escalate so quickly, it hasn't been revealed yet. But the silence suggests they believe the truth is still out there. And when it finally surfaces, it may force everyone watching this case to rethink what they thought they knew about that quiet Saturday night, and about the person who may have been standing on the other side of Nancy Guthrie's door. What really happened inside that quiet house on Saturday night? When you circle back to the beginning of this story, the most unsettling detail isn't the FBI's presence or even the reported evidence outside the door. It's the contrast. The gap between how normal everything was and how quickly it turned into something investigators now believe was deliberate. An 84-year-old woman doesn't simply vanish from her home without help. Not when she struggles physically, not when she leaves behind the things she would need. Not when law enforcement veterans say plainly that the scene told them this was more than a missing person. And yet, days later, there are still no public answers, no suspects named. No arrests announced, no explanation for why federal agents had to step in so fast. That silence is frustrating. It's agonizing. But it's also revealing, because investigators don't stay quiet when a case is going nowhere. They stay quiet when they believe something is unfolding, when talking too soon could jeopardize what comes next. Think about the position Savannah Guthrie's family is in right now. On one side, a public-facing world that wants updates, clarity, reassurance. On the other, a private nightmare where every knock at the door might bring news they're not ready to hear. Savannah herself is used to delivering headlines, not becoming one. Used to asking questions, not waiting for answers about her own mother. There's an irony there that's hard to ignore. The woman who helps America make sense of tragedy every morning is now trapped inside one of her own. with no script, no teleprompter, and no certainty about how it ends. This case also forces a larger, more uncomfortable reflection. If someone can be taken from their own home without a sound, without witnesses, without immediate answers, what does safety actually mean? How much of our sense of security is built on routine and assumption rather than reality? Investigators have made one thing clear through their actions, even if not their words. They believe Nancy Guthrie did not choose to leave. They believe something happened to her, and they are treating this as a serious crime. That alone should stop anyone from brushing the story aside, because behind the headlines and speculation is a very real woman, a very real family, and a question that has not yet been answered. Who knew she was there? Until that question is resolved, the story remains open, unfinished, hanging in that uncomfortable space where hope and fear exist side by side. And that's why attention matters. Pressure matters. Memory matters. Cases like this don't move forward when they fade quietly from public view. They move when people keep asking, keep caring. If you're watching this, share it. Talk about it. Keep Nancy's name visible. Because somewhere, someone knows what happened that night. And eventually, silence gives way to truth.